What if I told you that in the United States of America, a country that prides itself on freedom, you could be sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for buying a completely legal, non-firing replica gun? Sounds absurd, right? In this video, we'll talk about a shocking case where a former U.S. Navy sailor saw his entire life collapse after the ATF went after him for what can only be described as a nightmarish example of government overreach. This story centers on a man named Patrick Tate Adamiak, who once had aspirations of becoming a Navy SEAL officer, one of the most elite military paths this country offers. He didn't just want to serve his nation, he wanted to push himself to the very pinnacle of military excellence. As part of his personal interests and to fuel a dream he had of building a personal museum, Adamiak collected various gun parts as well as some replica guns. One of these replicas was a Denix STEN Mk submachine gun. If you're familiar with World War II history, you know the STEN was a staple of British forces, cheap to manufacture, easy to use, and famously recognizable by its bare-bones design. But the thing is, the Denix version he purchased wasn't a real STEN. It was a zinc alloy decorative piece, incapable of firing without extensive, improbable modifications. Even so, this so-called toy landed him in federal prison for 2 decades. How does something like this happen? How could a man on the verge of serving his country at the highest level go from an honorable Navy career track to sharing a cell in a federal prison? A lot of it comes down to the ATF's classification power. Let's break down the specifics of Adamiak's case. You have a young man on the fast track to become a Navy SEAL officer. Along the way, he got into buying and selling gun parts. He did well enough to become one of the top 500 sellers of gun components on GunBroker, which is an online marketplace often used by firearms enthusiasts. But somewhere in the midst of all this buying, selling, and trading, the ATF swooped in and accused him of dealing in machine guns, even though the parts he owned were legal and widely available through reputable retailers. He never stocked the sort of contraband you'd expect an actual arms trafficker to have, like fully automatic rifles or the necessary contraptions to turn a semi-auto into a full auto. Instead, he had fragments, pieces, and yes, an entirely non-firing STEN replica made by Denix in Spain. Now let's make one thing absolutely clear. Denix replicas are generally recognized among collectors as decorative items. They're made from zinc alloys. They don't have rifled barrels. They lack functioning bolts or other components needed to fire live ammunition. Typically, you'd see them in reenactments, theatrical productions, or behind a display case in a war museum. You wouldn't walk into a gun shop expecting to see a Denix on the shelf as a viable self-defense weapon. They're lumps of metal intended to look the part, nothing more. And yet, this didn't stop ATF Firearms Enforcement Officer Jeffrey Bodell from making it the central part of his crusade against Adamiak. Bodell decided to test this Denix STEN to see if he could force it to fire a round. He concluded that it could be converted into a working firearm by using a real STEN barrel, a real STEN bolt, some electrical tape, and by manually loading a single round in the chamber. The magazine wouldn't even fit into the replica once the real barrel was forcibly taped in place, so Bodell had to jam a single cartridge directly into the barrel by hand. And yes, after all of that, the Franken-gun he created managed to fire exactly 1 round. That was all it took for Bodell to declare it a machine gun under federal law, somehow ignoring that machine gun is legally defined as a weapon that fires automatically more than 1 shot without manual reloading. A single manually loaded shot is about as far removed from an actual machine gun as a muzzleloader is from a modern-day semi-auto rifle. So you might be wondering, how does this get pinned on Adamiak? How does the existence of a replica that only became minimally functional after serious tinkering that no normal collector would do, end up being the reason a judge slapped someone with a 20-year sentence? That's where we have to look at the testimony and reports from the ATF. Bodell wrote a detailed report describing how simple it was to turn this replica into a weapon. According to him, no specialized knowledge or tools were required. He just needed 3 items: a real STEN machine gun barrel, a real STEN bolt, and electrical tape. Well, guess what? If you're a federal agent with a well-stocked evidence locker, maybe you can scrounge up enough random parts to try any what-if scenario. But as far as Adamiak and everyday Americans are concerned, These modifications are about as realistic as saying you can build a space shuttle with household items if you rummage around NASA's basement for a rocket engine. Adamiak never had those real STEN parts. He never tried to convert the replica. He bought it for $75 at a gun show, purely because he thought it was a neat historical piece he could display. Despite the illusions the ATF tried to craft, his collection was not an arsenal of black market machine guns. It was basically a hodgepodge of legally purchased parts, along with a few toy replicas made by different manufacturers. Anyone else can buy these same things online today. No background checks or special forms required, because they're not regulated as actual firearms. Meanwhile, the government used them to lock him up like some kind of war criminal. Right about now, you might be thinking, this is insane. How can the government get away with this? Or, why haven't I heard more about this travesty of justice? Well, stories like Adamiak's don't always break through the mainstream media bubble. They challenge a narrative many in the media are comfortable pushing, that the government only prosecutes bad guys with illegal guns. But those of us who pay attention to Second Amendment issues know that the ATF has a troubling history of overreach. Stories of constructive possession, where someone is accused of having an unregistered machine gun merely because they own parts that, in some labyrinthine way, might theoretically be assembled into a forbidden configuration, are not new. What is new is the boldness of turning a Denix showpiece into the linchpin of a federal prosecution that results in a 2-decade sentence. When you think about it, this case could send chills down the spine of every American who values their constitutional rights, which is why the mainstream media is mum about it. If the ATF can treat a zinc replica as a machine gun, what else can they twist? Where does it stop? And can you imagine spending the next 20 years in a federal prison, away from your family, simply because a government agent performed an unholy experiment to force your non-functional display piece to spit out one round? The government's argument hinged on the definition of a machine gun from the GCA and the NFA. The ATF claims anything that shoots is designed to shoot or can be readily restored to shoot qualifies as a machine gun if it can fire automatically without manual reloading, or if it's the frame or receiver of such a weapon, or if it's a combination of parts that can be turned into such a weapon. But the Denix STEN does not, in its original form, shoot automatically. It doesn't shoot at all. It's a fancy paperweight. The same goes for the other items in Adamiak's collection, which were legal gun parts, parts that, if you or I went to a gun shop or a legitimate online retailer, we could buy without violating any laws. Yet, once Bodell decided to patchwork real firearm components onto the replica, suddenly the ATF wanted to treat it as if Adamiak had a full auto STEN locked and loaded, ready for action. What about the part where they say, yeah, but he sold a bunch of gun parts online, so he's basically a trafficker who just didn't get caught yet? That's just speculation with no basis. People who collect or deal in firearms or parts often buy and sell a wide variety of items. This does not make them criminals. If they possess the correct licenses, follow the laws of their jurisdiction, and keep records as required, that's their right. The Constitution does not say you can only have a certain number of parts or that you can't profit from the collectibles market. In fact, commerce in firearms and accessories is older than this nation itself. The tragedy is that Adamiak had his entire life turned upside down. He was at the cusp of a career as a high-level operator in the Navy, Tier 2 or perhaps even Tier 1, depending on how his trajectory panned out. Instead, he now sits in a federal prison in New Jersey, essentially a victim of a politically motivated or personally motivated stunt by some ATF officials. According to Adamiak, the entire ordeal is riddled with falsehoods. He says that everything he owned was legal and that the ATF agent, Bodell, misclassified everything in the entire case. He points out the most glaring contradiction. If Bodell had to jam a single round into the barrel to get one shot off, how can it be considered a machine gun? Automatic fire demands multiple rounds go off with one pull of the trigger. But hey, why let the facts stand in the way of a politically useful narrative that lumps more so-called illegal machine guns into the ATF's stats? It's not just the Denix STEN. Bodell also examined other items, including another toy gun, an M240 replica made by Jing Sheng, which is basically an airsoft or display piece, and tried to claim that was close to being a real machine gun too. The fact that a real bolt and carrier group couldn't even be installed in that replica apparently didn't matter much. He refused to give a classification for it and left it hanging, implying that it could be close enough to an M240. When the government lumps in these sorts of toys, lumps them in as suspected machine guns, we really have to ask ourselves what's going on. If these items are so easily available, legally from reputable shops, then thousands of Americans who own such replicas are all potential felons, just waiting for a few scraps of metal and some electrical tape to transform them into prison inmates. Some might argue, well, maybe there's more to the story. Maybe he did something else that led to these charges. But from every publicly available account, including statements from Adamiak's legal team and experts who examined the seized items, this case is as straightforward as it appears. The guy bought some collectible parts and replicas, the ATF performed questionable tests, and a court took their word for it, sentencing him to 2 decades behind bars. Infuriating. Adamiak is still in prison, doing menial tasks just to keep himself from going crazy, thinking about the injustice done to him. He's parted from family, friends, and his future. The irony is that the STEN replica was likely something he barely even thought about after purchasing it. It was just a curio for a museum he dreamed of opening one day. Instead of being recognized for his ambition and commitment to serve, he was portrayed as a would-be weapons smuggler or a subversive gun trafficker. That's heartbreaking and maddening all at once. If there's any silver lining, it's that stories like this can wake up more Americans to what's happening. It can galvanize us to question the unchecked power some agencies wield. It can prompt us to support organizations fighting for the Second Amendment and to demand our elected officials hold the ATF and similar agencies accountable. If we don't raise our voices and push for legislation that clearly defines and limits what bureaucrats can do, we might all find ourselves at risk of the same kind of misclassification and prosecution. Now, if this outrages you as much as it does me, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and click on the bell icon for more of these videos. We need to spread the word about stories like Adamiak's to ensure they don't happen again. When more eyes are on this kind of miscarriage of justice, there's a greater chance that public pressure will force a re-examination of these dubious convictions, or at the very least, force agencies to think twice before pulling another stunt like this. Ultimately, the core message is simple. We must remain vigilant. The Second Amendment is not negotiable, and if we allow one person's rights to be violated in such an egregious manner, we set a dangerous precedent that can erode the liberties of every American.